Hello and welcome to DILAN Delivers, our free webinar series from the DILAN Consulting Group. I am Dr. Eugene Dilan, and today I'm going to be your host and the presenter. For those of you who don't know, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist with former experience as a nonprofit executive, and I'm also the founder of the DILAN Consulting Group. For over 27 years, I have helped leaders and organizations build cultures where people and performance thrive. This year, coming February, we will be celebrating 15 years of being in business with the concept idea of business being human, being at the centerpiece of everything that we actually do. So, today's conversation is about reimagining DEI, and we're going to explore why inclusion and belonging, not just diversity, are key to the future of workplace culture. You're going to leave here with insights and actions that can actually help you to move your organization forward, I think, in a much more effective way that's going to have a positive impact on your bottom line. With that, I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available to you on YouTube over the next couple of days. Also, please use the chat function. I'm not going to be zooming in and out of quizzes and things like that. Instead, I'm going to ask you to comment in the chat function. And so please type in there and I'll address some of the questions as we go along. I do, however, have about 40 slides, so I will be judicious about what questions I respond to. So with that, again, I want to really underscore the fact that we believe business is human, and fundamentally what that means is that people are the secret sauce of your organization, and that is where your focus needs to be. Something about the objectives for today at a very high level. Hopefully you're going to walk away understanding why the traditional DEI efforts fell short. I'm going to unpack that a little bit and speak to the missteps that perhaps didn't allow us to optimize the successes. Secondly, we're going to talk about the shift from DEI to inclusion and belonging, which I believe is a lot more sustainable, mostly because we as humans are hardwired for community, for connection. And so belonging and inclusion is really foundational to that. And then lastly, as I just said a few seconds ago, you're going to walk away with some practical next steps that will help you and your organization to move forward. I'd like to start with the same frame I use in every workshop that I run. What behaviors do you want to see in yourself and in others that will promote your learning today? And because we're short on time, I took the liberty of jotting down a few things that I think will help us to create a safe place for everyone. And so here we go. Respect, foundational, I think, to being able to work together, communicate, active listening, assuming positive intent, and as I always kid, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. So sometimes we actually have to make reparations, even though we had good intentions. Let's have some fun and humor, because I think we learn more that way. Let's not be judgmental. Not everybody has to agree on everything. What's important is that we engage in dialogue. And lastly, confidentiality. If you share something in the chat, let's keep it here in the room so that this how people will feel comfortable coming back and sharing again. So let's look at some headlines, and oh my God, have there been a lot of them over the last 6 months. Everything from some corporations pulling back to the US investigating Stanford and some states actually banning DE&I, and how organizations like universities are finding workarounds. And I think that's some of the good news in all of this. And of course, we all are clear on this particular point. Trump is hell-bent on killing DEI. And again, it's interesting that not all veteran diversity pros disagree. So that's an interesting point as well. And I think I'll be able to explain a little bit of that as we go through. So not all the news is bad news. However, we do have allies both individual as well as corporations, Costco being a big one, Apple, Levi's. So here are some headlines that I hope will give you a little bit of hope. They sure give me a little bit of hope, because if we're going to affect change, we cannot do it alone as people who might be diverse. It has to be with allies from wherever they might come, corporations or individuals and people who are different than us. So with that, here's the beginning of what I think is hopeful news. The U.S. will become minority white in 2045. So 2045, that's 20 years from now, I am going to be very, very old by then. However, the picture is actually much different when I share this next slide with you. And the bottom line is that I think we're going to begin to see some changes in terms of the demographic starting in 2027, when the 18 to 29-year-olds are actually majority minority, if you understand what I mean. And as you see this timeline over time, each age group will age into being the majority of minority people in the country. And so that tells me that we're going to see some changes sooner rather than later, because people in those age groups can vote, and young people in general give me a lot of hope, because they don't see and understand the world and diversity and gender and all that stuff in the way that some of us old timers do, because of the way that we were raised. Now, that said, another thing that gives me hope is on this slide. As you can see, there are still a ton of enforceable civil rights laws, like the 1866 Civil Rights Act, the 1871 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, Title IX, 1972. Again, it's all here. And so this tells me that we still have some laws on our side helping to protect people who are vulnerable, like the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so not all is lost yet. And so I think that we can count on these, as well as the corporations and individual allies, I think, to begin to create shift in our society, although it might take a little bit of time. Let's kind of do a little bit of a shift of our own. And I want to speak to a little bit about the myths that are out there that I think have undermined the good work that has been done. One of the big ones that I think has gotten a lot of publicity is that DEI leads to hiring unqualified candidates. Let me first say that DEI was always intended to create opportunity for qualified individuals by removing barriers. Now, I think in the run-up after George Floyd, a lot of organizations who were well-intended tried to effect change. And as I said, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's really one good example of how I think there was a lot of user error in the implementation. And I'm going to speak more to that in a little while. DEI is reverse discrimination. So again, never intended for that to happen. I actually don't think it happened, and I've got numbers to prove that it hasn't happened, and that's going to come up in a few slides. DEI, again, was always intended to level the playing field, promote fairness, remove the obstacles, remove the bias. So the next one, DEI is just a one-time training or checkbox. If we had any failures in DEI, it was that particular mindset. And, what were people's motivations for doing it even in the first place? Was it to check the box? Was it to be able to use it as a marketing scheme? I have no idea, but I do know that DEI is not about a one-time training or checkbox. It is about organizational change, creating culture. Changing systemic changes. And so it really does require ongoing commitment, learning, and as I said, culture building. Lastly, DEI is unnecessary in a post-racial society. Just because we had Obama That does not mean that we are post-racial. And again, disparities persist, and DEI, or whatever it's called in the future, I'm voting for belonging and inclusion, I think is going to remain vital in order to create true equity in this country. And again, I have the numbers to prove that the disparities still persist. So let's do a little bit of a poll. And again, I'm not doing a traditional poll where I'm going to bring up a thing and you can vote. I'm actually just going to ask you to put your comments into the chat. So let's move to the first one. And the first one is, which group has benefited the most from DEI and affirmative action initiatives in the United States? If you could just chat, type your answers into the chat. No, it wasn't Latina women. It is actually white women. White women were the group that thus far have benefited the most. And what you'll notice at the bottom of every slide is that I've put down my sources so that you can go back and double check me if you don't believe what I'm saying. And I actually think that one of the benefits of sharing sources is that people can go and learn and be educated on their own, which is something that I think sometimes is lacking in our lovely nation. The next question. Which group has benefited from DEI initiatives in ways that include access to flexible work, parental leave, mental health support, fairer promotion practices, and safer workplaces, even if those benefits were not originally targeted at them? And the answer is, that is correct. It's white men. And this is someplace where sometimes I think that we could have done, and in general, I think the people who are of a certain ilk in the liberal sphere, sometimes we fail to communicate as effectively as people who have other points of view. I think we could do better in terms of helping people to understand how diversity is about everybody. And because if I asked even the audience here today who considers themselves diverse, most white women wouldn't, and yet they are the most the highly the best benefactors of this movement. And white men, however, have also benefited, and I'm not sure that people understand that, and I think that they need to. The third question that I have is, what is the primary goal of contemporary diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the workplace? All right, let's see what it says in the chat. Okay, and the correct answer is, which you guys got correct, to build equitable systems that support success for all employees. And now the last question that I have, which is here. As of 2023, which group had the largest gap between their share of the US population and their representation in the C-suite leadership roles? Drum roll. And the answer is no, it's not African Americans. And the answer is that, I'm sorry, the correct answer is African Americans have the largest gap. And I am actually going to share those stats with you in just a moment. And here we go. Black African Americans. And once again, I want to point out that I have the sources on the bottom of the slide. And now let's get to those stats. And what you'll see here, this comes from the US Census 2020 and 2023, McKinsey 2023, Harvard Business Review, and Catalyst Race and Ethnicity in the Workplace 2022. So what you see here is that Caucasian white Americans comprise 58% of the general populace. Black or African American is 13%, Latino or Hispanic is 19%, and Asian Americans are 6%. So if you follow this year for year, in the year 2020, white or Caucasians basically made up the C-suite at 85%. In 2023, 82%, and in 2025, 80%, compared to African Americans that in 2020 had 3%, in 2023, 5%, and in 2025, 6%, and Hispanics 4, 5.5, and 6.5, and Asian Americans faring fairly well in that they're at 8.5%, compared to the fact that they only comprise 6% of the population. Now, again, I want to go back to one of the earlier slides that you didn't see, where I spoke to the fact that people felt that it was reverse racism. What you can see here is that, again, anybody who feels under threat has really no reason to feel under threat, because there is a very long time before people in the other racial groups will actually catch up. It's moving slowly, but again, the intention was never reverse racism. It was to create fairness. Now, I have more data for you that supports this and actually gives you a little bit more of the background story around education. And what you'll see on this slide is basically that the high school completion rates, which is that first section, let me see if my cursor, if I move it, if you can see it, high school completion or higher, and it goes from 2021 to 2024. I truncated looking at more recent years because I thought that would be more interesting for us. And so what you'll see is during the high school years, most groups are doing about the same, with Hispanic Latinos doing less well. And then as soon as we get into associate or bachelor's, that's when you really begin to see the huge disparities. And then as you get bachelor's or higher, even more so, and then masters or higher, even more so. What's interesting for me here is that as a Latino man who has a doctorate, I comprise 4.7% of the Latino population here in the United States, in terms of the fact that I have a doctorate. Now, what's important to note is that there are reasons why different groups are doing less well. A lot of it has to do with economics and has to do with all kinds of things in terms of different schooling happening in different neighborhoods, and how economically some schools fare better than other schools. It has to do with the economics happening in people's homes. You know, I grew up, as some of you know, quite poor, on and off welfare. My parents were learning English as we were in school, and going to college was not even something that I knew about, other than my teachers had gone to college. But in my personal life, I actually knew no one. I didn't have the role models. So what I'm really trying to say with this slide is that this really speaks to the need for earlier interventions, because I think that if we can help people at a younger age, I think that reaps rewards for many, many, many years. And the best example I can give you of that is me. I benefited from preschool. I went to preschool at 3 years and a half. And I think that set me up for success in terms of, again, helping me throughout my educational career. So moving right along, I'm going to kind of jump to this topic now, which I'm calling professional negligence or malpractice. Now, why am I saying that? I am calling what I'm about to share with you malpractice or professional negligence, because if under any other topic or situation you went to the board or the C-suite of an organization and you said, I know how to improve employee engagement, I know how to improve innovation, I know how to improve your bottom line, and then you didn't do it, you would be in a lot of trouble because it just makes business sense. So I'm going to share a little bit of data with you about that. And I have more data, but I'm starting here. As you can see, innovation goes up by 39% when you have a diverse leadership in your organization. And there's a lot of research that also shows that even having women on your board increases the financial bottom line of your organization. Decision making is 60% faster. You get 87% better outcomes, research by Gartner. Profitability goes up by 27%. Again, that link with diversity, McKinsey 2024, so that's very recent. Engagement, 22% boost in employee engagement and retention when you have diversity. Gallup 2024. Stronger customer trust, 30% higher brand loyalty and satisfaction. And so the point that I'm trying to make is not doing this doesn't make business sense. It makes business sense to bring these best practices into your organization because it will make you that much more competitive. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about why I think some of these initiatives actually failed. And I have a list. It's a pretty long list. I'm going to take a deep dive into some of these items. And I don't know that my list is necessarily complete. There may be other reasons, but this is some of the stuff that I saw as I moved through the world delivering DEI workshops and programs and doing DEI assessments. So as you can see, there are four big buckets or factors with a stack of sub-factors. And what you'll see is that there were, firstly, many strategic failures as we went out and attempted to implement DE and I initiatives. For starters, a lot of organizations kind of bolted it on. And what I mean by that is that it was never really integrated into the strategy and the incentivizing and the leadership of those organizations. It was this separate thing in the back office. And as you can see here, oftentimes it wasn't funded. Oftentimes there was no leadership involvement. Oh, that is really good and important, but give it to everybody else. We don't need to participate. We've got this. And or no leadership sponsors to really kind of clear the path of any obstacles that there might have been. And then right up there, I want to put lack of practitioner expertise and organizational clarity. And what I'll say by that is that what is clear to me is that any DEI effort is really about change management. It's about changing the culture and practices of an organization. And while some practitioners may have had good training in terms of their background around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and or great lived experiences, what I would say is that they lacked organizational development expertise. And so I guess what I'm saying is that knowing the content well does not mean that you will be able to implement and effect change. In this next area, I have structural and operational failures. So oftentimes it was very prescriptive. Top down, here's what we're going to do, and the rest of you just need to follow. And I think that we lose people. Basic, again, organizational change management speaks to the need for user-centered design. You sit with people, you analyze the data points that you have, you try and define what the problem is, and then together you create the initiatives so that people feel ownership, so they don't feel victimized with, I'm being made to go to this thing, I don't even understand why. And so again, very important to open up the tent and include people, again, in the diagnosing, in the prescription, and in creating whatever your initiatives might be. Lack of data. So often people came in and delivered workshops, but there was never a pre-assessment or any sense of understanding what are we trying to fix in this organization. And so there was a disconnect, and we all know that we pay attention to the things that we measure. If you don't measure where you are, how will you know that you've made any progress? And how will you know if people are actually leaning in and trying to affect change? Over-reliance on training without structural change. And again, I've spoken to this already a little bit. And what this really means is that even an unconscious bias workshop, well-intentioned is great. But if you don't begin to look at your hiring practices, the structural things, if you don't begin to look at whether or not you're using structured interviews, if you don't begin to look at where are you going to hire people, are you always looking on LinkedIn, or are you going to diverse venues or avenues so that you can get a different kind of personnel applying? So you got to look at the structural stuff. And failure to support and retain diverse hires. Again, there's that myth that we were hiring unqualified people. No, we've hired a lot of qualified people because there are plenty of qualified people. What we did was set them up. We brought them in and then we left them alone without giving them the support, the mentoring, the sponsorship. We didn't create the psychological safety to have them thrive in the environments that we brought them into. Moving on to the next section, cultural and perceptual failures. Again, I think the word diverse can do a disservice in that people begin to think this is not about me. And I have a little bit of a hunch that sometimes some white people felt othered. So here we are having conversations about DEI with the intention of saying, let's not other people. But I think depending on the approach that you take, if you don't take a growth mindset that we're all on a learning trajectory, it's very easy to say or do something that might cause someone who is otherwise an ally to begin to feel othered. And so I think, again, that there may have been some opportunities there. Perception of diversity hires, again, as I said early in this webinar, anybody who really and truly believes in DE&I cannot believe that we would hire people who are not qualified and set them up to have to work in an environment that basically does not welcome them. Again, to me, that would be mean, which is never the intention of DE&I. And so I actually think that I want to use the word user error, that sometimes good intentions, but user error in terms of not understanding what to do effectively in terms of creating, I think, a welcoming and inclusive environment. And so, yeah, some people may have been hired who didn't have the right skills, but that was never the intention. Again, I call that user error. A lack of psychological safety for underrepresented employees. I cannot say enough. I have felt, not safe in some environments that I have moved in my life. And I know what that feels like. And I'm going to ask you what that feels like in a moment. But again, I cannot say enough how when you don't feel safe, your best self never comes to forward. And the impact of political and social environment. Again, I cannot say enough about these are unprecedented times. And even us having this conversation today might put me on a list somewhere. But I think it's important for us to keep speaking and to keep educating people and to keep leaning in and to keep embracing allies, because we cannot affect change alone. And then lastly, poor communication. Again, I think whether it's the choice of words or not communicating the rationale because we didn't really do assessments. So if you don't understand the baseline, you can't communicate what you're trying to solve for. And then lastly, a one size fits all. And I promise you, I've traveled the world. And even in some of our early work, we worked with a company that was based in Asia, based here, and based in Europe. And it became apparent very quickly as we were doing some early morning Zooms how the lived experiences of these people these cohorts in our program were having completely different experiences around DE&I. And so this idea of a one size fits all is bound to fail. You really, again, have to understand your audience, understand the environment that you're operating in. And even here in the US, the experience of people who live in university towns or live more toward the borders of the country have different experiences than people in the middle of the country. So again, you cannot approach this with a generic approach. It really needs to be specific to the populace that you're trying to work with. And so these are some of the reasons why I think ultimately we ended up falling short. And as I said earlier, there may be others that I did not capture, but I hope this gets you thinking, because this really, I think, begins to speak to the opportunities, the places where we can do better. So moving along, I'd like you just to take a moment yourself, and I'm going to be quiet for about a half a minute, which is really hard. I'm going to be quiet for about a half a minute. And I'm going to ask you to think of a time when you felt that you did not belong. Maybe it was at work. I've had a couple of workplaces where that was for me. I can remember being at Rutgers as an undergraduate student and just feeling like I did not, again, I was the first one from my family to really go to a four-year school, and even in social groups. And I know how that made me feel. So I want you to think about how that made you feel, and what was it that made you feel that you didn't fit in, and how did that impact you? How did that impact the way that you showed up? So take a moment, and then I want you to use the chat and just give me some key words about the impact that that had on you. All right, so I'm going to be quiet for a second. Okay, I want to invite you to just write a few comments in terms of what that felt like and maybe how it impacted the way you showed up. Discouraged and alienated. Thank you for sharing that. Who else? Please share a few words. Lost confidence. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Who else? Okay, going once, going twice, okay. Contributions were ignored typically until a non-minority male or white person repeated what I said. I learned to not speak and participate, which was then held against me. Thank you for sharing that, Latanya. I really appreciate it. And so again, I can say to you that I have been in situations like that, confidence. And you're right. At some point, you just say, "What's the point? Why do I want to beat my head and keep trying when I know what the outcome is going to be here?" Now, I ask you to reflect on this because this really, I think, begins to speak to the solution, the path forward of where it is that I think that we need to get to. And so I want to share what the definition of inclusion is, and I've captured two of them, Harvard Business Review and from SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, and I think that these are helpful. Inclusion is when people feel that they are valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate. And then SHRM says inclusion is the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, have equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. All right, very important definitions here. And now I want to share the definition of belonging. Belonging in a DEI context refers to a person's sense that they are accepted, valued, and included as their authentic self within a group, team, or organization. It goes beyond inclusion by focusing on whether the individuals feel psychologically safe and emotionally connected to their environment. Now, psychologically safe, I'm going to come back to that because ultimately I believe that belonging, inclusion, DEI, whatever you want to call it, that is what we all need, because we human beings are social beings and we want to feel a part of. And when we feel a part of, I think confidence goes up. We're willing to take risks, but I am getting a little ahead of myself right here. So let me just share this slide because I think it's important. Inclusion is what we do. It's the policies that we put in place, the way that we behave by making sure that we ask people for their opinions if they haven't spoken up. It is the systems in terms of how we hire people. It is the systems in terms of how we promote. It's all of that stuff. And again, but I want to underscore, it is the actions that we take in order to create an environment where people feel valued and empowered to participate. Belonging is the outcome. When you do really well at creating an environment of inclusion, people feel differently. It's the feeling that results when people consistently experience inclusion. It's the emotional sense of, I am accepted here as my full self. That means you don't have to hide. You don't have to think about what the politics, the impact is going to be of whatever you say or do. Again, inclusion is the action, belonging is the outcome. Now, I want to just share a little bit more in terms of statistics and why this is important, why we need to shift to focusing on belonging and inclusion. And so what you'll see here, it says that DEI initiatives often focus on diversity metrics, but as I said before, the numbers don't really tell you much if people don't have psychological safety. Because it's the psychological safety, again, that helps people to lean in, to really, I think, bring their whole self, their ideas, their safety in terms of feeling that they can challenge. And so again, numbers by themselves don't do much. Belonging drives business performance. As you'll see here, 50% increase in job performance and 50% drop in turnover when you begin to move into the context of creating an environment where people feel that they belong. And then again, what you see, diversity, equity, inclusion has become politicized, leading to resistance in some organizations. But again, underscoring belonging is a universal human need. Every single one of us needs it. Even those of us that, and I'm not really speaking of me when I say this, even those of us that are introverts, we need connection. You know, even when we're an introvert, there are times when we very much want to feel that we belong and we're a part of, and that it's okay for us to speak up. And so moving right along, I want to share this little chart, which really, again, speaks to the importance of going beyond diversity on its own. So what you'll notice here is that this chart is really, I think, describing and showing us how diversity and inclusion together increase the ability, I think, to innovate and increase the ability to feel safe enough to challenge the status quo. So if you look from left to right, that really speaks to the increase in diversity. And if you look from the bottom to the top of the chart, it speaks to the levels of inclusion, with higher inclusion being at the top of the chart. And so this organization, this research that was done, really speaks to that overlap of diversity and inclusion. And as you can see, as people have more of both of those, more inclusion and more diversity, the benefits are crazy in terms of people feeling that they can innovate. And I think the stats here basically said, I forget how much, but you can see is that, again, innovation went up, and the safety, the sense of safety in terms of being able to challenge went up in these organizations. And again, this comes from Bain in 2020, The Fabric of Belonging, How to Weave an Inclusive Culture. So again, diversity by itself does have some benefits. But ultimately, if you really want to get the most benefits, you need to create that environment where people also feel genuinely included in order to optimize the benefits of the two. On this particular chart, a much simpler chart, it just basically says, again, that when people feel included, ultimately, they end up promoting your organization. And that's sometimes very important in terms of recruiting good people, as opposed to people who might be passively, aggressively bad-mouthing your organization. And so that good people will not be attracted into your organization. So it says overall, about 14 times more likely to be promoters of your organization is what it says on this chart. Very important. So I want to move. I've been talking a lot about again, inclusion and belonging, and ultimately the goal of trying to get to a place of creating psychological safety. I want to give you a definition. And so psychological safety, a shared belief held by members of a team that others on the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish them for being themselves or speaking up. More specifically, a person named Clark in 2020 came up with different stages in terms of inclusion. And the first stage is inclusion safety. Satisfies the basic human need to connect and belong. In this stage, you feel safe to be yourself, are accepted for who you are, including your unique attributes and defining characteristics. The next level, according to Clark, is a place where I think you feel safe enough, I think, to ask questions. You feel safe enough to give and receive feedback, to experiment, to make mistakes, knowing that it's not going to cost you your job or be a blemish on you professionally, or even worse, because sometimes when you are a person who is diverse, anything that you do gets projected onto your whole community. And so knowing that you can learn and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, huge, again, in terms of being able to bring your best self. Contributor safety satisfies the need to make a difference. Again, feeling that you can use your skills and abilities, and more than that, that you're making a meaningful contribution, that people are helping you, I think, to see that what you're bringing to the table is actually making a difference. And then lastly, challenger safety. Again, feeling that you can speak up, feeling that you can say, wait a minute, I don't agree with that. Feeling that you can offer, I think, ideas in terms of how to change and how to improve. Ultimately, I think this is what we're all seeking when we go to work. And I think that if you have this, again, if it's a fair environment, an inclusive environment where the opportunities are there for everybody, then ultimately, I think you're going to experience these 4 different layers of, I think, of psychological safety. And so again, I think this is what we're really seeking in all of our initiatives. And I think that when you use language like this, it doesn't other. And I think it's in a lot of ways easier for people to, I think, psychologically wrap their heads and their hearts around, because who doesn't want to feel psychologically safe? So with that, I have a ton of ideas in terms of what you can do in your organization to really embed a lot of these initiatives. I'm not going to read all of this. It's a content-full slide, but I am going to just pick and choose a few things. For starters, you need to think about whatever you're doing, how do you make it core to your business? And so thinking about, if this is my strategy, how does DEI, belonging and inclusion, whatever you want to call it, how is it embedded, not bolted on as an afterthought, but thinking about, again, how do we capture more market share? Well, if that's one of your strategies for your organization, well, thinking about how does diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, how do those things actually support us in terms of capturing more market share? So it's not an afterthought, but ideally it's the thought you have up front, because you're using that to guide all of the decisions that you make. Leadership accountability. So again, you have to develop your leaders to create an environment on their teams where people feel psychologically safe. You need to develop your leaders to understand emotional intelligence, meaning that it's not a one-size-all that's going to bring the best out in your people. You need to look at how do you mitigate for biases, and how do you create decision-making processes where people, even if the decision is yours, but you at least allow people to weigh in so they have some ownership. You got to think about creating data-driven decisions. Companies move beyond performative DEI, it says here, looking at the metrics. How might you measure your organization in terms of where it currently is, and then set goals in terms of where you want to be, and then you revisit those. So whether it's dashboards or some other mechanism, but again, if you don't measure it, you will not know if you're making progress. And also, you cannot really tell a good story around what you're trying to fix, and so it doesn't make sense for people. When you have good data and you say, here are the opportunities, it's easier to help people to come along because they understand what it is that you're trying to do. Tailoring inclusion strategies to local and cultural contexts. Again, the way I might approach something in New York might be different than I might approach it in Florida or Texas. But my point is small town versus a large town, that you have to think about your audience, and also, looking at national, for instance, data in terms of the amount of diverse communities may not be helpful when you're in the middle of America and you're trying to understand what diversity means there. You need to look at that community's diversity and then build your plan around what's actually happening in that community. Although to some degree today, because we have a lot of virtual work, you can actually make other kinds of decisions that aren't grounded necessarily in the local demographics. But my point is that you shouldn't automatically use the national demographics as your point. You have to look at the local demographics. So these slides, again, will be in the YouTube tomorrow when it gets posted. So if you want to come back and look at these or take a screenshot right now so that you can come back to it, because there's a lot of good ideas here. I've already spoken to psychological safety, and so I am going to move on and to my next slide. So I want to speak to structural inequalities because, again, it's not enough to teach people around what unconscious bias is or any of the other potential skills. You have to go beyond that, and you have to begin to look at the processes that you have in place, and are they supporting fairness or not? Are they inclusive or not? Are they giving people a sense that they belong or not? And so again, the easiest example for me to use is the example of hiring practices. If you always have used the same what's the word I'm looking at, channels in terms of advertising positions, and you're not getting a diverse response, then maybe the opportunity is to look at what new channels might you use to advertise positions. If you keep the structure the same, then there's no way that you're going to get a different outcome. Again, very, very simple example, but I hope it makes it clear for you. So auditing your existing systems in terms of trying to understand where are people dropping off, who's getting promoted, who's not getting promoted. Again, data will help you to do some good thinking around what you might tweak. And so working to get that data will take you a long way in terms of, I think, creating a safer, fairer, inclusive, and an environment where people feel that they actually belong. Making sure that everyone has access to opportunities. If, again, they have the skill set. We're not talking about diversity for diversity's sake. We're talking about making it a level playing field so that people who do have the skill set are offered the opportunity. And then lastly, look at what the norms are. I'll give you a silly example, but it drives the point home in that if you have a norm in your organization that everybody goes drinking after a big sale, again, I'm just making this up, but you have people who either have families or who don't drink, all of a sudden these people don't fit, because the people who are out partying together build relationships and build bonds, and may even have some conversations about business that if you have small children and can't partake, or you're a person who doesn't like to drink, all of a sudden you got excluded, even though, again, that wasn't the intention. But and again, that example is simple, but we don't think about those things when we think about how we celebrate wins. And it's important to think about those kinds of things. So again, simple things, but I want to give you an example that some of you have already seen because some of you have participated in our workshops. And this is an example from the early 1970s, but the research was done in the year 2000 that really speaks to the fact that a long time ago, the amount of women in orchestras was a mere 5%. And then they did some experimenting with blind auditions, maybe even having people behind a screen taking off their shoes so you can't hear, heels. And I'm happy to say that, the number went up to at least 25% in the year of 2020. And today, this little structural change in terms of how people are interviewed to join orchestras has probably made a difference in the area of 30 to 55% increase in the proportion of women who are now in professional orchestras. So again, simple example that drives home how a little tweak can actually level the playing field, giving people who otherwise are highly skilled but otherwise would not have made the cut simply because of biases that people were not aware of. So I want to just speak a little bit, because we're coming to a close soon, speak a little bit about how do you integrate belonging and inclusion into your business strategy. So again, you have to think about these 4 pillars in terms of the places where you begin to have an impact. And so again, you need to think about how do you work on performance in your organization by integrating belonging and inclusion. You have to think about your customer and partner relationships and how do you help them to feel included and like they belong. How do you give your employees an experience both from what they say from birth to from cradle to grave in terms of when you first recruit them all the way in terms of their work-life experience. And again, thinking about your core business strategy, are you thinking about how everything that you're doing to execute on that strategy may or may not help people to feel like they're included in the process? So that is more or less what I wanted to share with you. I am going to take some questions in a moment, but I wanted to share with you that I've put together a couple of ebooks, a part 1 and a part 2 that have a lot of data. If you look at this QR code, it'll take you to our website where you can download one or both of these books. And at this point, I just want to remind you that we are on social media, and most every day we post something about leadership, diversity, coaching, team building, emotional intelligence, all kinds of content. In case you don't know how to reach us, but I think I know everyone who's here, here is our contact information. And now I'm going to stop sharing and open up to any questions that you might have.
Good afternoon. Hi, Eugene.
Hi, how are you?
Good. You've shared a lot of data statistics with us throughout this process today. And I'm curious how often you find that this collection of information actually sways your stakeholders or C-suite folks into engaging this? And if not, what other tactics would you suggest or do you use?
Yeah, I would say that probably about half the time, Latanya, there are people who are receptive to this. They realize that at the end of the day, the business case is what makes a difference. And I'll say that, in general, people on boards tend to pay attention to what's going to give them money. I hate to say it so plainly, but a lot of the time it does come down to that. And so I would say probably about 50% of the time people are saying, oh, and that's going to make a difference. And then there are some people who are a lot harder to impact. And sometimes what I find, Latanya, is that what does make a difference is somehow if you can make it relevant to them. And I'm going to give you a personal example. There is someone in my family that married into my family who wasn't really paying attention to this until their daughter experienced some stuff. And then all of a sudden, and so somehow if you can make it personal and relevant, and again, I think that this is one of the places where we maybe missed an opportunity in that we weren't educating people about how it was benefiting them personally. And my friend Patrice, who was supposed to be here today, she's the one who said to me that words like diversity might be a barrier because people are thinking, well, I'm not diverse, but yeah, you are. And B, look at how it's benefited you. Even the word critical race theory. She's like, Eugene, that's American history is what she said to me. And so when you call it critical race theory, again, people might say, well, that's not about me. But if you call it American history, okay, now my ear is open and I want to understand more of this other perspective. And so we have to think about the language that we use, because as simple as that sounds, language can be a barrier sometimes. In terms of whether people track you or don't track you, whether they're willing to sit and listen or not sit and listen. That's a very humble, simple response, Latanya, but I'm not the expert. I have some expertise. So any other questions?
Eugene, one of the things that you mentioned as you were talking was, maybe this is going to get me put on a list. And so, I mean, that's just kind of like, that's the elephant in the room, right? So how, I've actually had candidates from Canada concerned about working for an American company, just because, so there's this balancing act that we're trying to do. We know the climate, and we know what's happening. So have you thought about how, are you going to stick with DEI as the terms? Is there potentially even like either the way you just rephrase critical race theory to be American history? Like, have you thought about how we can position it so it is inclusive? Really, an inclusive word that's not the forbidden word.
Yeah, I personally am leaning more and more toward belonging and inclusion. And you'll see, even as I spoke today, I go back and forth sometimes. But I do believe that belonging and inclusion is really ultimately what the goal is. You want people to feel psychologically safe. You want them to feel that they have a voice, that they can challenge, that they can make mistakes, that what they have to contribute is valued. That's ultimately what we want. And that's, I think, a human condition that we all have. And so if we can speak in terms that open up the aperture, I think that we may be able to bring some people along. And I kid a little bit when I say I could end up in a list, but I could end up on a list. A few months ago, I was published in the National Review, which is a very conservative newspaper, and they quoted me for about a page and a half. And so I thought, oh, well, I may be in trouble here. But ultimately, I think that we need to keep engaging in conversation, because going quiet and being afraid, I think is prematurely, I think, going to work against us. I think we need to continue to engage people and find ways to continue the conversation. Yeah.
I was just thinking the saying that there's no such thing as bad press, Eugene. Because I think there'll be a cycle. I'm just sort of thinking about the framing over the next 3.5 years or so.
Yeah, I think in the sense of a corporate environment where you're trying to hire someone, I think you need to speak to the values and the culture within your organization. And if you have any examples of how your organization is different, and how your organization is actually being mindful to include people and being mindful to help people to feel valued and heard and create a sense of belonging, then that ideally will be enough. And if it's not, then that may not be the right candidate, honestly, because this is a time of turmoil, and you cannot offer someone the safety that doesn't exist. You can just bring your best self and try and do right in terms of your own behavior and your own values and your own leadership. And ultimately, people have to decide when enough is enough for them, because I think we all have to take care of ourselves. So, yeah. All right. I think that brings us to a close, unless anybody has anything else. I thank you all for joining me. Bye now.